Like, do you even know who you are? I am black, biggity black, American, yes, but bigger than that. Spitting opinions, rooted in facts. Hope you aware the culture is bigger than plats. Used to be a summit, now we got a podcast.
So, welcome everyone. This panel's topic is reparations for Black Americans. This has been increasingly a hot topic. I'll say, though, that it's been a topic that has concerned African Americans for many, many years. One of the things that, first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Cecilia Conrad. And one of the things that's not mentioned in my bio is that I'm an economist. And back during the Clinton administration, when Bill Clinton talked about and tried to unsuccessfully move forward an apology for slavery, my aunt, who was in Louisiana, who at the time was in her early 80s and had spent a lifetime as a mathematics teacher in the public schools there, she wrote a letter to the editor for the local newspaper. And she said, an apology is fine, but money would be better. And the money that she was particularly addressing was the fact that there were separate pay scales up until the 60s for Black and white teachers across most Southern school districts. So for really performing exactly the same job, she was, by law, paid less for that work. And so it would have been perfectly possible at that moment to calculate what her back pay would have been. And in fact, I even tried to do that for her and have actually done some reparations for that differential in pay. I ended up writing a paper about that for a conference that was the National Economic Association, which is a group of Black economists, had a panel. An economist, Richard America, was really the leading proponent of paying a lot of attention to the question of reparations. And for many years, he would organize a special issue of the Review of Black Colonial Economy around reparations. When you see the intro to Sandy and Kirsten's book, they acknowledge the role that Dick America had in influencing them to work on this topic. So I'm particularly excited to moderate this panel today. We have five great panelists. And let me say a little bit about the two who you can currently see on the screen, and then I'll stall introducing the last two in hopes that we can get them on the screen. First of all, we have Tracy Jan. Tracy covers the intersection of race and economy for the Washington Post. And this is a beat that she launched in December 2016. It's a new beat for the Post, I believe. Is that right?
Yes.
And it's so exciting to follow the stories that you've covered. She looks at racial economic disparities, immigration, housing policy, and other stories that hold businesses and politicians accountable for their decisions and promises. And we'll hear a little bit more about her work. Susan Kamei is the author of a new book that you can pre-order now, but won't come out until the fall. Is that correct? From Simon & Schuster. When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II. This is a narrative history of the wartime incarceration of 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. She herself is the granddaughter and daughter of incarcerated persons, and she was a volunteer leader in the campaign for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that acknowledged the wrongfulness of the incarceration and provided token reparation payments to the surviving incarcerees. Our next two panelists, who we hope will come on soon, are Kristen Mullen, and I should just preface this, they're two of my oldest friends, so it's going to be good to see them virtually. Kristen Mullen is a folklorist and founder of Artefactual, an arts consulting practice, and of Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of colors to the Carolinas. Sandy Darity is the Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. Together, they have co-authored the book From Here to Equality, and I thought I had it sitting here ready to show you. I will pull it up in just a moment. This is From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. This is a 220 publication of the University of North Carolina Press. So we will welcome Sandy and Kristen when they join us. But I'm going to start just with some level setting, because reparations can mean very different things to different people. There are many different concepts out there. And even among those who agree that reparations might be appropriate. I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about different concepts of reparations that you've encountered, and what do you think is the one that we should really focus our attention on? Susan, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure to be with you, and it's a real honor to get to have this chance to be in conversation with Tracy. I've admired your work, and Cece. I've got some scripts and Claremont stories I'd love to tell you later.
Oh, good. I should say she just called me by my other name, Cece, and that's fine.
I took the liberty seeing the emails. So yeah, I think of reparations as being a word that exists on a pretty broad spectrum, and it could. I have experienced it in the Japanese American redress campaign, and thinking about this as everything from an acknowledgement that wrongful acts even took place. That there's just as I might be able to expound upon a little bit later, just a fundamental role of education that would even bring about the need for a reparations conversation, to an apology or an acknowledgement or ownership that there was wrongdoing, into concepts of restitution, meaning or what are the ways we could do something about that. And then into forms of what constitutes restitution or restoration, which would include payment, and then things that might be beyond payment that are transformative to society. And then the concept of, on the far end of the spectrum, that reparations might be a way to heal past tragedies, past injustices, past hurts, not just to individuals, but to the society at large.
And Susan, can I ask one follow-up? When you talk about things that might be transformative to society, do you have any specific examples you might share?
Sure. I mean, I think it's I think what's hopefully going on in the difficult circumstances today, that there are inequalities, that there are long-term systemic intergenerational impacts, and that there is a greater understanding and connection on individual levels with people that are not from our own personal communities, and that we might not otherwise have an ability to relate to. So one would just to be, bringing everyone together on a same page, and being able to have more compassion and empathy for plights of others.
Thanks. Tracy?
To Dr. Conrad, to answer your top line question on people's understanding of reparations, I don't think the broader population understands what reparations would look like, partly because I don't think there's a consensus among policymakers and activists. I've called Professor Darity many times to run various programs that have been described as reparations to me. I run them past him, and each time he says, that's not reparations, because they are not direct cash payments. Instead, anti-poverty programs have been billed as reparations, like Congressman Clyburn's 10-20-30 program, which directs at least 10% of funding from any given federal program to counties where 20% of the population has lived below the poverty line for 30 years or more. Several Democratic presidential candidates have recast this program as reparations during the last presidential campaign. And I was actually on the road with Congressman Clyburn in South Carolina in early 2020, right before the pandemic, visiting communities that have received this funding boost, mostly Black communities, but also many rural white communities. And he's embraced this rebranding because he says it's more politically palatable than cash reparations paid to individuals. He's flat out said he's never going to individualize reparations, and he believes it should be applied institutionally across communities that have been neglected. That said, public support for reparations has doubled since 2002, just when back then, just 14% of Americans believed that the government should be making cash payments to Black descendants of slaves. That was according to a Gallup poll, but other polls have come up with similar statistics. But still, that, doubling since 2020 from 14% is still a very small number of Americans overall. So an overwhelming percentage of Americans still oppose cash reparations. In 2019, it was just 29% of Americans supporting reparations. And most of the increase is accounted for with Black Americans supporting reparations more and more. So there are many Americans who believe citizens today should not be forced to pay reparations because they were not responsible for slavery. But what they don't understand is the many ways in which they have benefited from the institution of slavery.
And I want to pick up on that topic a little bit in just a moment. But going back to this question of reparations and how you define it, I want to tie into the first question that we have in the chat about reparations for Native nations. And I've seen stories in the media recently about national parks and reconveying those to First Nations as a form of reparations. And I wondered if you would reflect a little about how that may or may not fit into the concept. Any thoughts on that?
Susan, I'll let you answer that because I actually have not done a lot of reporting on it. All I know is that every time I write about reparations, the natural question is, what about reparations for Native Americans?
Yeah. Well, I go back to a lesson that I took away from the Japanese American Redress campaign, and that's that the campaign was just as much about public education for us as it was. We didn't know whether we were going to be able to either judicially or legislatively achieve an apology or anything as defined as payments or some compensatory scheme at the end. So I'm not the economist in the group, so I think more of these public education, the kind of work that Tracy does as being just as much a vital part of the achievement, and in fact a condition preceded in order to be able to get to the political and social will of whatever form of reparations, as I think Sandy is defining it. I think the identity, the idea that there are a number of communities, in addition to the Native Americans, that have had systemic and long. Oh, there they are.
Hello, everyone.
We were trying to channel you two.
Yeah, so we were, Susan was responding a little bit to a kind of question that I posed a little from our chat. We were talking about different conceptions of reparations. And so welcome, Kristen and Sandy. I've already introduced you to the group. And one of the things that we had noted is that the many different ways people mean it, beginning from, as Susan pointed out, acknowledgement of wrong, to apology for wrong, to various transformative things that might happen to institutions, to healing, and then also to direct payments to individuals. So do you want to add to that notion of the various concepts of reparations that are out there, and the one that you focused on in your book?
Well, actually, I think the one we focus on in our book encompasses all of those things, that we're essentially saying that reparations constitutes all of those elements. And that's why we say at the beginning that we define reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
I don't want to interrupt you. See, okay. So you had asked us to kind of talk a bit about some of the, the problems, the opposition to the whole notion of a redress movement for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And, we would like to say that, perhaps the most recently voiced arguments against reparations, is a thinly disguised put down of, you know, the redress component itself. You know, this trivialization of the symbolic and substantive importance of the direct reparations payment to these eligible recipients. People will say, it's just a check. It's just a check. Or they will counter by saying, okay, so the check is fine, you know, but let's talk about systemic racism. And, you know, for us, it's like, you know, they are, you know, overlooking the capacity that a check of the magnitude that we're talking about would provide for, you know, individuals to, you know, to engage in political, you know, participation and actually move the needle on structural racism. So, you know, we believe that cash payments must constitute a large portion of the program, and that this is the only way that the Black-white wealth gap is going to be closed. We studied redress programs abroad and in the United States, and direct payments were determined to be the preferred path. Germany made cash payments to the victims of the Holocaust, $80 billion before the pandemic, and an additional $662 million in 2021. The US government made and continues to make restitution to those victims and their families, even though they were not the perpetrators. In the United States, Japanese Americans who were unlawfully incarcerated during World War II received direct payments. Initially, only the living surviving internees were deemed eligible, but ultimately the heirs of the victims who had died also received reparations. The victims of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, 2,983 individuals received cash payments. $7 billion was paid to 97% of those families who had died, which came out to about $2 million of $2 million tax-free dollars each. And the remaining 3% who chose to appeal their cases in a, quote, non-adversarial informal hearing are thought to have received about $5 million each. The 2,300 individuals who were injured received about 400,000 tax-free dollars. Then, more recently, the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Victims of Crime set aside $8.3 million for the victims of the Boston Marathon bombing attack. And in 2015, Americans held hostage in Iran were awarded up to $4.4 million each, or $10,000 per day. $10,000 per day for the 444 days that they were held in captivity. So to date, that's the largest reparations payment, per day to an individual that the U.S. has ever paid. So then the question is, well, how big is this Black-white wealth gap? And Sandy's going to lay out the facts for us.
Well, as a fellow economist, Cece, I guess I'm supposed to lay out the numbers about what the cost of the program should be. But let me say at the outset that this really does involve measuring the immeasurable, insofar as it's quite clear that the range of atrocities that have to be taken into account, which begin with slavery but do not end with slavery, the range of atrocities that includes nearly a century of legal segregation in the United States, accompanied by white terrorist campaigns that resulted in the loss of Black lives, but also the seizure and appropriation of Black-owned property by the white terrorists, the atrocities that have taken place in the aftermath of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, atrocities that are an extension of the types of harms and damages that were taking place before, which would include mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Blacks, discrimination in housing, employment, and credit markets. All of these things are reasons or rationales for reparations for Black Americans who had enslaved ancestors in the United States. And all of those events, including government policies like the application of the Homestead Act, overwhelmingly for white families, or the discriminatory application of the Federal Housing Administration and the GI Bill, all of these have produced a glaring racial wealth difference in the United States. a wealth difference that has a magnitude of $840,000 on average per Black and white household. This also corresponds to a circumstance where Black Americans with enslaved ancestors in the United States constitute about 12% of the nation's population, but only possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. And so from our perspective, a program of redress or the redress component of a reparations program must involve elimination of the racial wealth gap. And this would require an expenditure of at least $11 trillion to close the gap, to create a situation in which the Black share of wealth corresponded to the Black share of the nation's population.
So I want to come back to the 11 trillion and the arguments that you have, the plan for how this could play out over time for a moment. But I wanted to explore a little bit more the discussion around the wealth gap and the historical events that help to contribute to that, historical patterns. And Tracy, I want to bring you in just a little bit, because I know in your coverage, you've talked about one specific incident that has become people have become more familiar with, one among many, and that is the Black Wall Street, the Tulsa bombing. Could you talk a little bit about that story?
Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the stories I mentioned earlier, where I called Professor Darity asking about, whether something was reparations. Dr. Darity, I was saying earlier that I would ask you multiple times whether certain programs pitched as reparations were reparations, and you would always say absolutely not, because cash payments were not part of it, and it was not targeted towards closing the wealth gap. So with the Tulsa massacre, I wanted to take a look at that story on the wealth that was lost on Black Wall Street back in 1921, a century ago, and what the impact has been for not only descendants, but what about Black Tulsans today, business owners who are there trying to make a living, and this revitalization of Black Wall Street that's been happening in recent years in the lead up to the centennial. And this time I was exploring it through the lens of business owners. The revitalization afoot in Greenwood is predominantly benefiting white property owners in this run up to this month's centennial marking the massacre. And while the city funnels millions of financial incentives to revitalize a business district, Black business owners say they're being shut out, that there are no longer landowners there because of both what happened during the race riots, during the massacre, as well as through urban renewal. They had a different term for it, the N-word removal. The headline of the story was the whitewashing of Black Wall Street, and a lawsuit filed by descendants and the survivor last September accuses Tulsa and its business leaders of continuing to enrich themselves at the expense of the Black community by appropriating, they used the word appropriating, the massacre for tourism and turning Greenwood into a, quote, primarily white-owned commercial hub, end quote. So I was just trying to write about reparations through yet another angle that had not been widely explored, similar to an earlier story I did in the series about Japanese American reparations, which we could discuss at a later time today.
So that was one story of the many that you gave in what is an amazing kind of documentation of the history of various policies, actions, either through the government or through non-governmental entities, to help deprive African Americans of access to wealth equality in the U.S. I'm wondering, as you look at the examples you've given and the case that you've made, what has resonated most? I know you've been talking to people all over the country about your book. And I'd like to also turn that question back to Susan after you've talked about it. What seems to resonate most with audiences, either audiences that are Black or non-Black audiences?
Sure, thank you. Well, I think the impact of
if I understand you correctly, you're asking, what do audiences find most compelling?
Most compelling,
yes.
Yeah.
And
so,
that
Susan,
is the massacres themselves. I mean, we find that people are not aware of the number, the intensity, the outcomes of these massacres, we certainly were not aware that they were as constant and that they had occurred all across the country, not just in the South. I had heard the term Red Summer, but I had no idea that we were, that over 30 separate incidents happened, and that they were in places like, Bisbee, Arizona, and Wilmington, Delaware. This was in Elaine, Arkansas, I knew about, and maybe Chicago, but apart from that, I had no idea. And certainly I was not aware of the sheer numbers of Black people who were just murdered outright and their allies, or what the consequences were. It hadn't occurred to me to wonder what happened to the people who remained or who were not killed. How many of them became refugees, and where did they go? And to what extent did those individuals who witnessed these horrors then silence themselves, silence their own political action? What was the extent to which they kind of hid their lights under bushels so that they wouldn't be visible targets of white jealousy and white aggression? Just a whole kind of picture of what happens when you have one after another assault of Black communities across the country. Certainly the Black press was talking about it, but the white press was not, making these connections for people and saying, this is a travesty, this is something that should not happen. In fact, all too often the white press was part of the apparatus that was fanning the flames. They would often, print a story that was just spurious or just some rumors. Or in some cases, they were advertising that, in 10 days, there's going to be a lynching. So it's like, well, all right, do you already have the supposed perpetrator? So, people would start looking for someone so that they would have this big, media event, like the one that was in, was it Longview, Texas?
Longview, Texas.
Where, there's an amazing, iconic photograph that's just, I don't know, it just makes me just sick on the stomach to see. But there must be thousands of people in the frame, this panoramic view, looking at the remains of this Black man who had already been drugged through the city. He'd been burned, he'd been dismembered, and just the remains, just the barest bits of a corpse that they then hung, and people made postcards. So yes, I think people are in awe, they're in shock. Many of them are ashamed to learn that this was part of our history. And in so many of these massacre situations, you had following the flight of the Black people who the white people who were responsible created declarations, political declarations, informing the world that they were now in charge and that there was no longer going to be any Black representation in their community's government. And they signed these documents. And we were encouraging people to take a look. Sometimes hundreds of names or hundreds of signatures are included, and look to see if your family is among them. That's real. When people can actually see, my family was, where were my relatives? Where were my ancestors who lived in Elaine, Arkansas, or in Wilmington, for example.
So one example is the White Declaration of Independence in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, which was the site of a municipal coup d'etat where elected officials, both Black and white, were driven out of office. In some instances, they were killed. And frequently people say that this was the only municipal coup d'etat in American history. That is not true. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War in the 1870s, in both Coushatta, Louisiana and Colfax, Louisiana, there were duly elected municipal governments that were overthrown by white terrorists. And I would say that there are two dimensions of these massacres in terms of what the intent was. The first dimension, of course, was trying to eliminate Black political participation via violence. But the second dimension was the appropriation and seizure of Black-owned property. And I think one of the most dramatic instances of that would be Ocoee, Florida, And in terms of what Tracy Jan has been talking about in the Tulsa context, it was not just a matter of appropriation of Black property, it was a matter of raising Black property to the ground to eliminate it altogether in a community that had very, very visible and powerful signs of Black prosperity.
That's right. I think that early accounts of the property destroyed valued it at nearly $2 million, which would be about 29 million in today's dollars, but that's a gross underestimate or conservative estimate just based on insurance claims and lawsuits that were filed against the city. And none of the Black property owners were ever compensated. Neither the city nor the state government committed any money towards rebuilding Greenwood in the immediate aftermath. In fact, many of the business owners who survived and stayed, because many of them also fled out of fear, relied on Black communities in the surrounding areas to come and use their wealth to help rebuild.
So one of the common themes here in terms is the dispossession, particularly of business owners, the targeting of business owners. And Susan, you were about to come in earlier, so I want to come back to you for a moment. Tracy, you've done a story about the loss of business ownership among the Japanese American community during the World War II incarceration. Could you say a little bit about that? And then Susan, I want to bring you back in.
Sure, it's a similar story, but instead of losing their lives, many of them, they lost their livelihoods. They were rounded up and imprisoned. And the ones who were able to own property, because it was illegal for immigrants to own property at the time, many of them had property through their children who bought property in their names, they lost their businesses, they lost those properties. One of the main characters of my story, of the Yamamoto Syphax family, Mitz Yamamoto, was a teenager when the government came and rounded up his family. And he remembers leaving in a car and looking back at the ripe strawberry fields that his parents had tended to. And that was all that money lost, right? They would never regain that. So Susan can speak more about it directly because of her family, but it's not just property loss, it's a loss of, it affects people's psyche for generations, where a lot of people that generation didn't want to talk about it. But I'll let Susan speak more directly to that.
Well, then actually my dad's family were vegetable farmers in Orange County. And my dad shared in the testimony in the Commission on the Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians in the 1980s about how his family had to leave behind a standing field of celery that was waiting to be harvested. And because and this is to the economic manipulation, the price of vegetables, and particularly of celery, plummeted to just about nothing before they were forcibly removed to camp. And then they found out once they were in camp that, and they couldn't even, it wasn't even worth their interest to harvest the celery because it was less than the cost of the wooden crates. And then they found out when they went into camp that the folks that took over my grandparents' lease harvested it, and the price of celery had soared to something like $5 or $6 a crate. So I think, but also not only did they lose the livelihood, the Issei, they really, at the stage of life that they were at, they also really lost the ability after the war to do anything meaningful. They just, it undermined their will to carry on. And for the Nisei generation, my parents' generation, that were American-born citizens, they, I call it the lost generation because they lost the ability to get an education. So, so many of the Nisei that were already in college couldn't continue or had difficulty continuing, and many of them that were coming out of the camps, high schools, just were not able to continue. Of course, many of them were drafted into the war. So to the point that Kristen was making, though, about this vastness of the sense of the tragedy and the different different. I guess we're having trouble hearing each other.
It seems as if, can you hear me, Susan? Because I can hear you.
I can hear you, but I don't. I see Kirsten and Sandy are muted.
Can you hear Kristen and Sandy? Kirsten and Sandy, can you hear?
Yeah, we can hear now.
All right. Okay.
But that was the first thing we heard was when you said, "Can you hear us?"
And we
Oh.
And we haven't heard Susan at all.
Yeah.
Okay. So Susan, I think we can hear you now. So
Okay.
Continue.
Okay. Well, I was just gonna
No.
I was just gonna chime in on how the impact of the personal stories, I think, were critical both in the Japanese American redress campaign, just to make it real to others in terms of them understanding how great the tragedy is. And to answer the question, well, why should I care? It's well, just being aware that there was this extent of impact.
So Susan, I'm going to recap because Kristen and Sandy couldn't hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear
Yes,
you.
yes, we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will recap that Susan was emphasizing the impact of the personal story, and she recounted her own family story and others about those who had successful business enterprises that they were dispossessed of and couldn't really regroup, and that it had not only the immediate economic impact but also the psychic impact that I think Kristen also talked about in terms of people who were forced to flee and to give up, and how long that could have an impact overall.
Well, and the generational impact.
The generational impact, that it lasts beyond the single generation who was impacted. Is that right, Susan?
Yes. Yeah.
I feel privileged that I get to hear Susan. Can others hear Susan?
I can hear Susan.
Okay. All right.
I don't know what the issue is.
Yeah, that's really, really bizarre.
Susan,
okay,
we miss you.
Uh-oh. She says, refresh the page. Dare I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, try that. Uh-oh. Well,
now we've
let's see if
lost
we
her.
get her back. So I'll turn back to you, Kristen and Sandy, to talk a little bit about the plan. And when Susan returns, I wanted her to outline the steps that happened that ultimately led to the redress to the Japanese Americans. But talk a bit about one of the criticisms of reparations is, oh, it's just too hard to do. We can't pull this off. And you have a really carefully outlined set of arguments about how this might be accomplished. So could you share that with the group a bit?
We definitely want to do that, but I wanted to say just one point about Susan's comment that the personal stories are what are really compelling. We are now, for the second time, engaging with a high school class, the Carborough Public School in North Carolina. And their teacher, Matt Cohn, who was really just a brilliant strategist, came up with this idea of having the students interrogate their family's wealth position. To find out, did your family benefit from the Homestead Act? Did your family members benefit from the New Deal, from the GI Bill? Any of these programs, and the students were incredibly skeptical. Hello, Susan.
I was trying to follow directions.
But I was talking about this high school class that we've been the second time. So they read our book, and in the second iteration, I think we've gone through. So their teacher had them create videos reacting their reactions to our book, and there's 73 videos. I think we've listened to about 25 of them so far, and so far every single white student's family has a family member who benefited from some combination, and in some cases all of these federal programs. And we've yet to learn of a Black student or a student of color whose family received the Homestead Act or the GI Bill, I think.
Right.
Even
Right.
I'm sure that we've got many more to go, but it's extraordinary to see how consistent the receipt of these federal largesse appropriations is in their families. But you asked us about the plan itself.
Yeah. So the plan that we have in mind has 4 central features. The first is we establish or designate who would be eligible to receive reparations. And under the plan that we have in mind, an individual would have to establish two conditions to be qualified for receiving reparations. And the first condition is that an individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And the second condition is that they would have to demonstrate that for at least 12 years before the enactment of a reparations plan or the enactment of a study commission for reparations, whichever came first, they self-identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American. So that's the eligible population. The second characteristic is that the legislation should be designed in such a way that it eliminates the racial wealth gap by building Black assets to such a level that they would be on a par with the average level of white assets. And so this is where the $11 trillion figure comes in as a minimum figure for the size of the reparations plan, because that's the amount that would be required at least to erase the gulf in wealth between Blacks and whites. The third characteristic is that the plan must prioritize direct payments to eligible recipients. And then the fourth and final characteristic is that the plan must treat the federal government as the responsible party for meeting the debt that's associated with reparations. And we refer to it as the debt because there is an unmet act of restitution that lies at the heart of this story, which is the failure of the federal government to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre land grants that they were promised in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Promise was never fulfilled, and as a consequence, we have been on a trajectory that has produced the modern racial wealth differential. And so the federal government is the culpable party, but we would also add that the federal government is the party that has the greatest capacity to meet this debt. So for example, if we were to consider the total budgets for all state and local governments in the United States, it would come to about $3.1 trillion. And so collectively, all of those entities would have to devote their full annual budgets to a reparations plan for 4 consecutive years to get to the $11 trillion figure. So, so those are the 4 components, or I guess what Kristen is now calling the pillars of a reparations plan for America.
There are a couple of questions that have come up too, clarifying questions. So I'm going to get to those in a second. Susan, go ahead. You had your hand up.
Yeah, so thank you. So because I had a question on the pillar about identifying an ancestor. So so it occurred to me, thinking about this in other conversations that we've had, Sam and Kristen, that how do will individuals need help with family history research? Do you anticipate that some kind of genealogical or family history support would be part of this? Because I would imagine not everyone would know how to do that or know where to begin to do that.
Yes, we absolutely think that the creation of an agency that would be staffed with trained genealogists who would provide this service free of charge for individuals so that they could establish if indeed they were eligible for reparations. I will say though too that ours is a country where many people have been interested in their genealogy, and as a consequence, there are a number of organizations, Ancestrycom. You've got TV programs like the one that Henry Louis Gates, who
Finding your roots.
So the tools have become much more widely available and understood. But yes, absolutely, we think the creation of an agency to assist individuals with this research would be a very important strategy to take.
Yeah, and I think we should add that there's an omission in the census that actually provides prima facie evidence that one might have had an enslaved ancestor. And that's the fact that enslaved people were not counted in the censuses of 1860 and 1850. So if you could establish that you have an ancestor who appears in the 1870 census, who was old enough to have been alive during the period of enslavement, and that ancestor does not appear in the 1850 and 1860 censuses, that indicates that that individual probably was enslaved. And that's the type of evidence or data that could be brought forward to support a claim.
So there are two additional kind of questions, clarifying questions that have been posed in the chat. One is, could you please elaborate on the definition of self-identifying as Black for 12 years prior to reparations? How is this not a constant?
Well, I mean, it's not a question of it being a constant. It's a question of whether or not you self-identified at some point in that period that's at least 12 years beforehand. And the way in which people could reveal that is simply by making public their self-report on the race question on the census.
Okay. And then the other question is, would the cash reparations as part of that 12 trillion come with stipulations on how people could use it?
So we would argue that no, they would not have strings attached. There were no strings attached to the reparations that Japanese Americans who were wrongfully interned received. There were no strings attached to the 9/11 award recipients, their families, none for the Holocaust victim, none for the Boston Marathon attacks victims, none for the Sandy Hook, horrible Newton public school victims. We're just curious to know why, when the potential recipients are Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, these kinds of questions come up. We want to know, what is that about exactly? This is exactly how successful reparations programs in the U.S. and around the world have been executed, and we think it's the strategy that should be made in this case as well.
So let me now turn to a topic we had started on a little bit at the early set about the role of education and how can we get to a place where we can have a serious policy discussion around reparations. Susan, you were talking earlier about the role of education in terms of the Japanese redress payments. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. So the challenge that we identified was that for the most part, Americans weren't even aware that this had happened. During the time of the war, the persons of any Asian descent, including Chinese, were either in Hawaii or on the West Coast. And so the media in the wartime, both the Yellow Peril and the ramp up and then the coverage after the Pearl Harbor bombing, was part of this, feeding of the government narrative that because someone was of Japanese ancestry, even though they were American citizens, they couldn't be trusted, that they had loyalties that were going to be tied to the land of their ancestors and not the country which the American-born Nisei only knew as Americans. And so for the most part, there was this narrative that's continuing and has been in existence for 80 years that, you don't understand, we were at war, these are the things that were necessary to do, everyone has to make sacrifices during the war, and if you didn't know any Japanese persons of Japanese ancestry, any Japanese Americans, all you would know at that time was what you would read in the newspapers and hear on the radio. And so even today, I have students at USC, which is why I teach this course, who are shocked to find out much later into their lives that this ever took place. And they're horrified that they didn't learn about it in school, or it wasn't something that was part of their education as they were growing up. So what we know is that for the most part, people didn't even know that it happened, let alone the wrongfulness of it or the impact of it. So that was where the role of the commission for the Japanese American redress campaign became it became critical. It wasn't the way the Japanese American leaders in the redress campaign wanted to go, but it was really Senator Dan Inoue, that said, if we're going to be able to get the votes in the House and in the Senate, they're going to need to know from constituents that this is an issue that their constituents care about. We can't even get there if people in the public don't even know that this happened. So it was a very controversial decision for the Japanese American Citizens League to go with Senator Inoue's proposal that as congressional leaders, they would first need to have a commission to take testimony, to hear from witnesses, make a report, and then from the report, make recommendations. Those recommendations ended up being the basis of the bill that resulted in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. So for the first part, it was there had never been a government record established. And so the hearings, and 33 years later, the fact that there were hearings and that individuals shared testimony and that we have them now as a written record became really the fundamental tipping point of what ultimately became the legislative success.
So in terms of a commission, Kristen and Sandy, I know a commission is part of your plan as you outlined, but when I compare a little bit the case for African Americans and the case for Japanese Americans, it's sort of stunning to me that these stories are not as widely known, or are they as widely known? And do you think that I mean, how do you see the role of a commission as different or very similar to what happened in this earlier case?
I think the roles, there, as you said, there are a lot of parallels, and the question of education, or I would say re-education, is really central. What you're looking at, is something that I call dismemory. Dismemory is this sort of systematic falsification of American history. And in the case of Black Americans, you're talking about, textbooks that were commissioned by the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the American Daughters of the Revolution that, romanticized slavery, that depicted this chivalrous, aristocratic South, these Southerners who, were valiant Confederate soldiers rather than the traitorous insurrectionists, that they were. But also belittling that incredible 7-year period of Reconstruction when the country had co-governance of Black and white people, and the accomplishments that took place under those Black-led, houses of government. I mean, this is where we first get public education for white children, was during Reconstruction, under the leadership of Black elected officials. All of that was, it wasn't even whitewashed. That was just eliminated from the history. It was certainly not, Cecilia, you and I both went to schools in Texas, and none of that was in the textbooks that I recall.
Well, that was one of the benefits of going to completely segregated schools, is that my teachers didn't teach from the textbook.
Yes, I mean, these were the exceptions, and but for the rest of the country, no. I mean, this is not the message that they received, and so one of the things that we think would be essential would be to have a very robust education component as part of the reparations initiative. We say too, because we have short attention spans, and we tend to, not to remember things unless they come to us over and over again. But but my hope is that we would have at least 3 continuous generations where the full history is taught, from kindergarten all the way through college. And, in the case, and Susan, I hope that you will speak on this too, our understanding is that in the case of the Japanese American Redress program, there was a robust budget for education that was to have, been available for, museum exhibitions, but also the development of curriculum materials, commissioning of plays, poems, musicals, public service announcements, but the budget was cut by 90% by Bill Clinton.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
as
and
a
it didn't
result,
last. Yeah, and it didn't last. Yeah.
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 And,
So-
as a result, people in Texas, where I grew up, just didn't get that information. I've done sort of an informal poll of friends and colleagues in California and in Washington State, and a handful of them do remember some PSAs,
Mhm.
but just, it's a small number of people. You do need a robust, long-standing education program for these basic tenets to become absorbed and routine. And that's the whole idea too of, remembrance days, pointed moments that recur to help us to remember where we've been and why we don't want to go there again.
One
Thank
thing
you.
I'd like to add is the idea of a commission as a prelude to a reparations plan is potentially quite valuable. But I want to caution folks that the legislation that's presently available for the purposes of establishing a commission, HR 40, is severely flawed. I don't want to go into a great deal of detail, but the legislation certainly is not designed to ensure that we would have a reparations plan that would emerge from the commission that would designate Black American descendants of U.S. slavery as eligible recipients, that would specify that the legislation must eliminate the racial wealth gap, nor would it ensure that direct payments would be made to eligible recipients.
Well, unfortunately, it's 2:00, and so we are past 2:00. But in the chat, we're reminded that there is going to be a follow-up panel in August during the Black America Summit too. And so I think we'll have an opportunity to pick up on some of these conversations. I'm sorry that we're not going to get back to talk about the media's role, and I'm thinking about the 1619 project and whether there are other ways that the media can't play. But let me just remind everyone that you can do some self-education. I now found my copy of the book to show, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And the copies aren't out yet. For Susan's book, which is due out in the fall, When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II. Thank you, panelists. Sorry about some of the technical difficulties. And thank you to those of you who've posed questions and hung in here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
It was a real honor to be with you all.
Like, do you even know who you are?